Good morning, everyone. We continue looking at the Geonim, and we were mid-story, or nearing the end of a story last week, so we'll just finish that off. I mentioned that the Geonim were caught up in a number of important battles. Um, they were battling against the lay leadership sometimes, the Reish Galusa, and we spoke about that last week, and fighting for the establishment of their authority as the Rosh Yeshivas. And over the Gaonic era is a long time, 500 years, 400, 500 years, depending exactly how you measure the period. Over that time, they sometimes prosper, sometimes less so. But that's one of their significant battles. They're also fighting, more importantly, perhaps, against the Karaites, and we discussed that last week, against the heretical denial of the authority of Torah Sheba'al Peh. They are also trying to normalize or stabilize, perhaps, some of the fundamentals of Jewish life, and we will spend time this week looking at some of their achievements. But much of the structure of normal life of daily Jewish life is formalized by the Geonim. So they're taking the principles that find their place in the Gemara, and they're applying those principles to give a sort of standard workable Jewish life. And amongst the projects that they are setting out to standardize is that of the calendar, the Jewish calendar. So, yes. Yes. Yes.
Like a handful, they sort of hang on, sort of very sorry about what they're trying to do. How do they maintain that?
Okay, so the Geonim, and this is alluded to, by the way, in the Yokum Porkon system, the title Gaon generally refers to those right at the top of the hierarchy. In other words, the Rosh Yeshiva, which at any one time could be 2, 3, or 4, something like that. Occasionally there's co-Rosh Yeshivas, occasionally there's more than the 2 yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedita and Machamasya as they move around. There's sort of other yeshivas that are set up. There's occasional little splits, but you're 100% right. In any one period, there's not more than 4 or 5 Geonim. However, they have Talmidim, and they even have Talmidim of Talmidim. We know that from 2 Geonic texts, from Kaddish, which talks about Al Rabbanon, Val Talmidon, Val Talmidei Talmidon. The rabbis, their students, and their students. That means to say there are people who are teaching Torah, but are themselves students of the Geonims. They're not granted sort of full rabbinic authority or autonomy, but nonetheless they're teaching students. They're students of students. We know this from the other Geonic text with which we're familiar, which is the Yokum Porkon, which again says Chol Talmidoin or Chol Talmidei Talmidon. Indeed, the Yokum Porkon text indicates to us their number of centers of power. There's the Reish, the heads of the assembly. These are the twice a year, another Gaonic institution, 2 months of a year, as many people as can come for Yarchi Kala. We still have nowadays, you have Yarchi Kala, right? The December holidays are approaching, and in various places there'll be Yarchi Kala, where people will go and stay in a nice hotel for 3 days and learn Torah. The Yarchi Kala, the literal meaning of the Yarchi Kala is Yerech. Yerech is like the moon, a month of gathering. And they established these, so there's the Reish Kala, there's the Reish Galusa, the Rosh Galusa that we spent, the exilarchs, Reish Mesivta, the heads of the academies, the Dayan Zobin the Dayanim at the gates, the Chol Talmidon, all their students, and the Chol Talmidon, the students of their students, the Chol Manda Oskim Raisa, anyone who's learning Torah. So there is a significant, all of that is just a quote from the Yokum Porkon. So there's a significant body of Torah scholarship going on. The Geonim are simply at the top of the tree. So we're calling it the Geonic era, but and by and large, the figures that we know about historically are Geonim themselves, the Rosh Yeshivas. By and large, the people who are writing the responsa are the Geonim themselves, though we have evidence that sometimes they would outsource one of their sponsors to a student. So they get a letter from Spain asking them for something, or from North Africa asking them halachic shaila, depending how busy they are, how interesting they find the shaila, or how important they think it is. Maybe they draft it themselves, maybe a student writes it for them and they just check it over. And occasionally there are figures who are not Geonim, but who still achieve prominence and sort of near Geonic status, or even more significant than some of the Geonim. We'll see when we run through, probably next week only, some of the history of the Geonim, some non-people who aren't technically Geonim because they never became the Rosh Yeshivas, but nonetheless are deemed the greatest of their generation. Perhaps they didn't become a Rosh Yeshiva because just the timing didn't work, they died in the lifetime of their master, or they didn't become a Gaon because of politics, the Reish Galusa didn't like them. but nonetheless, they're deemed the most senior sort of Talmid Chacham of the time. Very often, they ended up writing significant works. Why do they write significant works? Because they're deprived of students. They can't become Rosh Yeshivas because, let's say, the Reish Galusa won't let them become Rosh Yeshiva. So they're not able to teach in the traditional Gaonic style of teaching students. So instead, they pen a work. So, but you are correct. The most senior authorities at any one time are only a handful at most, if not less than that. So the Geonim are busy trying to, amongst many, many other things, they're standardizing halacha, and they are the source of many of the Piskei halacha. When we see in the Gemara, which is this massive open-ended work with constant debate, very often the Gemara doesn't draw a conclusion or a psak. The Geonim are paskening also and trying to finalize the works of the era of the Gemara. And one of the projects that they're standardizing is the calendar. Why are they standardizing the calendar? Because even though we have this sort of tradition that everyone's brought up with, that the calendar is completely based on witness testimony until the era of Rav and Abaya, or later Hillel II, Hillel the Hillel HaKatan. And then there's this sudden transition to a calculated calendar. It's not as black and white as that. It's not as digital as that. Already in the era of the witnesses, they are using some calculations. And in the era of calculations, they are still at least going through the ritual of formally being Mekadesh the Chodesh. So just to remind us of the history, 2/3 of the way into the period of the Amaraim, in Bavel you have Rava and Abaya. The Rambam tells us that that's when the switch occurred to the fixed calendar. In Eretz Yisrael you have an Amora mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi and elsewhere, Hillel HaKatan, Hillel II. Later sources attribute the time of the calculated switch to him. The two sources align. Hillel II is a contemporary of Rav and Abaya. It makes sense that the switch occurred in his time because he's the last known Nossi of the house of Hillel, and persecution then increases, and they switch to a calculated calendar. Last week I mentioned a machlokas, an argument between the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, about what lent authority to this switch. Either way, from the time of the switched calendar, it wasn't as if everyone now had a printed calendar that they could just, get a year in advance. Louise would publish a printed calendar and we could all see all the dates, and it's very simple. They're still using the rules of calculation. And the rules of calculation are not necessarily widely known. Perhaps they are preserved as a secret by the academies in Eretz Yisrael. And certainly, the right of formal declaration of the new Rosh Chodesh remains the privilege of the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. And they are declaring the new Chodesh every month, using the traditions they have as to how the calculations are made. More than that, it's possible that not every detail of the calculations was established by Hillel II. It's possible that some of the details were left more vague in general, and there was a degree of discretion even after that. This isn't clear. But either way, every year, the Rosh Yeshivas of Eretz Yisrael are announcing that year's calculation, and thus life continues all the way through to 922 in the Common Era. So we're now nearing the end of the Gaonic era, and by now the calculations have spread. The Babylonians, the Geonim and Bavel, are well aware of the calculations also. They do their own calculations to work out the calendar, but as an honor, they leave to the Rosh Yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael the formal sort of privilege of declaring that year's calendar. And as I mentioned, there is a Rosh Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, Reb Aaron ben Meir, who declares the calculation, and the Geonim and Bavel are convinced he's got it wrong. It's a very, very small error. It's a matter of seconds. But that has a sort of knock-on effect, a sort of chain reaction, which means that the calendar ends up 2 days out. So a few seconds difference in how you conceive of the time of the Moilad, the time of the birth of the new moon, affects when Rosh Chodesh will be. Will it be this day or the next day? And because of the rules, it doesn't shift it 1 day, it shifts it 2 days, because we've got various other factors that we don't want Rosh Hashanah to fall on certain days of the week. So, for example, Lo Adu Rosh. So let's say, for example, according to the Babylonian calculation, Rosh Hashanah is meant to be on a Tuesday. A few minutes difference means that the Israelis, Eretz Yisrael yeshivas, think that Rosh Chodesh is meant to be, Rosh Hashanah is meant to be on a Wednesday, but it can't be a Wednesday because Rosh Hashanah can't fall on a Wednesday, and therefore you have to shift it to Thursday. So you end up with a calendar disastrously 2 days apart because of a tiny mathematical debate. The Babylonians go crazy. The Eretz Yisrael Rosh Yeshivas have made a mistake. Eretz Yisrael says, young upstarts in Bavel, what do you know? We're the carriers of the tradition. We know what we're doing. You've messed up the calculation. We have a different tradition about how to do the calculation. And you end up in this disastrous situation in which the Jewish world is keeping two calendars, and the Babylonians basically say enough is enough. We are the dominant Torah center. We have been for centuries the dominant Torah center. We granted, respect to our brothers in Eretz Yisrael and to your academies, your yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. But we are the Talmud Bavli. We are the carriers of the air of Babylonian tradition. We are the true source of authority for halacha, and our calendar is right. Now, the wider Jewish community in the diaspora is confused, because on the one hand, they have been turning to Bavel for halacha for a long time. On the other hand, Eretz Yisrael has the prestige of Eretz Yisrael, and it's the most senior community. It's where Torah comes from. That's where we don't need to explain it. This is where we get Torah from. This is where we've always been taught Torah from, and there's confusion around, and therefore it isn't a simple battle. And steps forward a young Talmud Chacham, a young sage, not a Gaon. In fact, someone from out of the Gaonic centers. He's born in Egypt, Saadia, no less. Saadia steps forward, a young genius, a non-Babylonian. He's an outsider. He writes in Aramaic, not in Arabic. I'm sorry, not in Aramaic. He's not there in Bavel, modern day Iraq. He's in Egypt, and he takes up his pen, mightier than the sword, on behalf of the Babylonian viewpoint. And his learning and his rhetorical powers and his arguments and his depth of Torah knowledge and his brilliance, which is staggering, swings the Jewish world to the side of Bavel. Perhaps part of his weight is also because he's not a Babylonian. He's from Egypt, which is actually geographically closer to Eretz Yisrael and somewhat aligned with Eretz Yisrael. And he brings the debate to a close, and Bavel has decisively won. And as far as we can tell, 5 years later, when there's the next, this is 922 and 927, there's another time when the same debate could have erupted. We're not really aware of debate that time, though there may have still been some pockets of disagreement. And certainly by the 1100s, 1200s, this machlokas is long forgotten, so much so that no one even knows about this debate. We all sort of think our calendar has been completely non-controversial for all time. It is a credit to the Jewish calendar that actually machlokas was so minimal. But nonetheless, this was very serious business, and Saadia springs to the fore. 6 years later, he becomes the first foreign Gaon. So he becomes the first non-Babylonian Gaon to be appointed in Babylonia, and he becomes a very, very dominant figure, and a significant part of our future Shira about the Geonim, when we look at philosophy, will be around the figure of Saadia Gaon. So I'm not going to go more into his life now, other than to mention that this is the origins of Saadia Gaon. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so Eretz Yisrael, the argument is not a mathematical mistake. No one got the arithmetic wrong. Eretz Yisrael claims to have a detail of the calendar that Bavel wasn't aware of. And Bavel says, we've known how the calendar works for centuries. We were just being polite to you. We are the true heirs to the real tradition. Talmud Bavli, your senior scholars moved at the time of persecution from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. We have better traditions of halacha than you do, and we know that your claim of a sort of an exception to the rule, a detail of the calendar calculation, is wrong. So it is ostensibly an argument over Masorah. As I mentioned, there's some debate over whether this is the full picture or not. In other words, it is possible that actually what's going on is that Hillel didn't fully define the rules, and there are certain rare circumstances where the rules still needed to be thrashed out. And the Geonim aren't just carrying tradition, they're also thrashing out the details of the rule. In other words, Hillel, a later source says Hillel II, but someone at the close of the Hillel dynasty, probably Hillel II, it's certainly the time of Rav and Abai, establishes the fixed calendar, but it's not obvious that every single rule has been established and every single detail has been put in place. So maybe the Geonim are being mechadesh things rather than merely carrying tradition. You may say to me, how can I claim that they're establishing, innovating, if they say this is tradition? But we know that in the Battle of the Karaites, they said they had traditions for certain things, whereas senior figures, as the Rambam, didn't think that was the case. And they thought that this was a polemic argument, but really, actually, it came from reason. So again, I remind you about the maximalist position and minimalist position about authority of the Rabbanons, maximalist and minimalist position about droshas. How much is the Gemara innovating? How much is it carrying tradition? We don't entirely know the answers to these questions. The Geonim are very much off most of the time on the maximalist position side. They're claiming these are traditions. Who am I to Chas v'Shalom argue with the great Geonim? I couldn't, except that some of the Rishonim already say it may have been rhetorical devices. Maybe when they called something tradition, they meant this was absolutely obvious, and it was clear that this was the calculation's descent. It's not that they had a specific tradition about this particular point, but it's obvious to them that this is what the picture was meant to be, and this was the intention of the framers. It's a little bit analogous to the modern debate in law over in America. This is particularly prominent because of the nature of the way the Constitution works, about whether when we're trying to work out what the Constitution is saying, are we trying to work out what the original founding fathers meant? And that matters? Well, no, we don't really care what they meant. We're simply looking at the text of the law, and what the law says, even if it isn't what they meant, is what is carried within it. So the Geonim, when they argue for maximalist thing, everything that is a tradition, everything is a Masorah that they've got, do they really mean it's a Masorah? Or do they mean we're going to call it Masorah for common people, because that's what you don't understand the details of Halacha. What we mean is if you understand what the tradition is, then this extrapolation is obvious and inherent in it. So again, who am I to say when the Geonim say it's a tradition, they don't mean it literally? The Rambam and others already made this point. Yeah.
But I've heard that the extra detail of the calculation.
Yes.
I've heard that actually that's actually more accurate.
Okay, so this is something else. This is the Tkufas of Ada, and this is a different debate. Yeah, this debate is a very, very small technical detail about how we calculate the molad on that triggers the Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, which is the Rosh Chodesh that then sets the nature, the setup for the rest of the calendar. It's a question around half an hour of maximum of half an hour discrepancy, but sometimes that can be the tipping point in how the calendar's worked out. Okay, what you were referring to is another very, very significant debate. And again, I want just to make clear to everyone that a lot of these things are lost in history. This is all speculation. There are some debates and differences between a traditional view and modern day academic views around these things, led quite significantly by from academics, by the way, many from academics involved in this. And in many cases, there are traditional sources that also indicate this. So nothing I'm saying is sort of way off controversial. And I'm just trying to establish a sort of middle position around things, around how things coalesce. But what is clear is that nowadays, so we're going to press a pause on this battle. So just to conclude, we spoke about the Gaonic battle about against the Karaites, very important hashkafic theological debate. Gaonic battle against the Rosh Galusa, not a major theological debate, but one about control and autonomy and who runs Kol Yisrael, and a debate about the calendar, which obviously is major halachic ramification, and linked to that a debate around the authority of Bavel versus Eretz Yisrael, and something we will look at a bit later, the establishment of the Talmud Bavli as the final authoritative source. So again, if you are a simple Jew living in Egypt, many of the things we take for granted aren't so obvious. How do you know that the Talmud Bavli is more authoritative? Maybe the Talmud Yerushalmi is more authoritative. So these are all things that need to be established and are established in the Gaonic era. Another detail of the calendar, since Andrew's mentioning this, is, and one that, to the best of my knowledge, didn't lead to particular controversy. In fact, it so much didn't lead to controversy that we really don't know that many historical details of it. And it may be that it wasn't a Gaonic innovation, maybe it was a tradition they had. But briefly speaking, just like in the Christian world, they moved from a Julian to Gregorian calendar. There are two ways of measuring the length of the solar year, which affect how you align the lunar and solar year. So very briefly, the Julian calendar took an approximation of 365 days and half a day, 365 days and a quarter of a day. You can call it 6 hours, which is half a day or a quarter of a 24-hour block. So 365 and a quarter hours. Now, this is just under 5 minutes off. So the real calculation isn't 365 days and 6 hours, it's 365 days, 5 hours, 55 minutes, and 25 point something or other seconds. So it's about 5 minutes off. So if you use an approximation of 365 and a quarter days, you'll drift 5 minutes a year. And famously, this is what happens in the so the way you make a 365 and a quarter day calendar is by having a leap year every 4 years. So the Christians adopted a calendar in which every 4 years you had a February the 29th, and thus added a quarter of a day every on average per year, or 1 day every 4 years, and therefore you add a quarter of a day. Over time, the 5 minutes added up. You can do the maths yourselves. 500 minutes over a century, which is not far off 10 hours, and over time, the Julian calendar began drifting, and therefore, famously, Gregory, the Pope Gregory, in the 1100s, I think it was, shifts the Christian calendar, changes slightly the rules of the calculation, and remove a leap year every so often. In fact, remove a leap year when it's the fourth year aligns with the century, and also shifted the calendar 11 days because by then it had drifted very far off. We never had such a revolution because dating back as far as we can trace, Jews were aware of the more accurate calculation, and that is known as the Tkufa of Rav Ada. So the Tkufa of Rav Ada, Tkufa means like Hakofa, turning, the cycle of Rav Ada, the yearly cycle, the solar cycle of Rav Ada is remarkably accurate, incredibly accurate, down to degrees of precision of many decimal points into the calculation. It's an incredibly accurate calculation. However, for certain halachas, we also use the Tkufa of Shmuel. Now, the Tkufa of Shmuel, we know Shmuel is an early Amora, first or second generation Amora. He's a contemporary of Rav, so he's a younger contemporary of Rav, but he's the Babylonian transition from the Tanaim, the Mishnaic era, to the Amoraic era. And Shmuel uses for some calculations a cycle known as the Tkufa of Shmuel, the sort of Tkufa, the solar calculation of Shmuel, in which he uses what we would now call the Julian calculation of 365 and a quarter days. So he uses the less accurate calculation. And in halacha, we have running, if the calendar is not complicated enough, because we have solar and lunar calendars, so we're not happy with just a simple solar calendar, we're not happy with just a simple lunar calendar, but we have to align the two. Us Jews like making things really complicated. We're not happy with the Julian calendar, we're not happy with the Gregorian calendar, we want both. And for some halachas, we use the Tkufa of Shmuel, and for some halachas, we use the Tkufa of Rav Ada. Now, let me give you an example. For the Saint Talmud, we use the Tkufa of Shmuel. I think we had a speaker here a while back who recently, about a month ago, who mentioned this in one of the Shirim. I was already mid the Gaonic series, so I was planning to speak about this. So the Saint Talmud, who did we have to speak about? Saint Talmud? Okay, my favorites. So the Saint Talmud, we use the less accurate calculation. We use the Tkufa of Shmuel, which means that it drifts off. In fact, it's already drifted off quite significantly. And we live with that because, okay, big deal. So the Saint Talmud is using a simpler calculation. For the rare BeHa, many of you may remember it in, I think, 2000, when was it? Yeah, but every 20 years, when was the last one? Not that long ago, where we go out and get up early in the morning and we use the calculation of, it was before Pesach, I think in 2009, I think it was. No. It's every 20 years. Every 20 years. We had one in 2009. Okay, again, BeHa Sachama. We use the we link it to the secular calendar because it's a solar date. It's not a lunar date because it's linked to the solar year. But we link it to the Gregorian calendar in the sense that we use our modern day calendar, but the date is calculated using the less accurate approximation. I don't want to confuse anyone who's not super mathematical over here.
December doesn't coincide with
it doesn't coincide with the accurate. Sorry, yes.
We used to be fit. You know, the 19th century.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It shifts over time. Yes. So it's basically because we are using the more accurate, nowadays in Christendom in the West, we're using the more accurate calendar, our calculation every century drifts about a day. So we call it now fourth or fifth, as Andrew just said, in the past it's third or fourth. It will eventually shift in our lifetimes, by the way, to the fifth and the sixth. So it's gradually drifting off. And we are wrong, the non-Jewish calendar is right. Meaning, halachically we're right, because halach establishes it using the simpler calculation, the Tkufa of Shmuel. Astronomically, it's wrong. Now, this doesn't matter that much, because we're not talking about calendar calculation. We're just talking about when we start praying for rain. It's a big deal. You get the calculation of rain off a few days. Thank God we have plenty of rain here in England anyway. It's a text of tefillah. So and tefillah, by the way, is rabbinic, and they were entitled to establish it using the simpler calculation. And BeHa Sachama, again, which I'm not going to go into the astronomy behind that, but again uses the simpler calculation. Sorry, yeah.
Then you have the major dispute as when was the world created?
I'm not going into. I'm not. Yeah, I'm here talking about the Geonim. I'm not dealing with all that. There's no shortage of things to debate and discuss in Yiddishkeit. I'm simply talking about this calendar debate. Now, for other things, we use, for example, for the alignment of the solar and lunar calendar, which does matter because this is really important because we need to ensure that the solar and lunar calendars coincide, that Pesach remains in spring. There's a 19-year cycle, and there we use the more accurate Tekufa of Rav Adar, the more accurate astronomical calculation. Now, why would we, and that drifts much less. That drifts a few seconds a year, and we've got thousands of years left till it ends up disastrously wrong. We've got plenty of time to sort that out. Now, why would we use two parallel systems? And who is the Rav Adar who created the more accurate cycle? So why would we use two systems? The answer is, well, calendars have always been fixed by niche specialists who understand the maths of the calendar. Indeed, the calendar for centuries was fixed by the experts in Eretz Yisrael, the Rosh Hashivas. We just spoke about that. So for the calendar, you can use complicated maths. Knowing when to say the Saint Talamota, that the layperson has to know. Again, we're not talking about an era where everyone can just go online and check what the date is, or everyone can just download a calendar. We're talking about an era where people just have to know how to function. So for the less specialist, for the Saint Talamota question, which doesn't have the same significance, by the way, it's simply a text of Tefillah. Tefillah is important, but at the end of the day, the text of Tefillah is rabbinic. The calendar ultimately gets down to derisa things about when Pesach falls and whether it falls in the right seasons. So it makes sense to use the simpler formula for the Saint Talamota. So just to summarize, there are two ways of doing the calendar. I hope I'm not losing anyone here. There are two ways of doing the calendar calculation. One that uses a mathematical approximation, which is less accurate, and one that uses a far more accurate calculation. And we use the more accurate one for the basic framing of the calendar, which really matters. And we use the less accurate one for issues of ritual, for example, for Saint Talamata, which matters a little less. Yes. Yeah. This all uses a Hebrew date calculation, different calculation. Again, we're not going to go into that. Now, who was this Rav Adar who introduced the more accurate calculation and formula? Well, we don't really know. Now, by the time of the later Geonim, it was already lost in history. It was someone who lived centuries back, and many assume it was the Amora Rav Adar, Rabbi Rav Adar, who we know about. There are indications, however, and that's the simplest answer. If it came in the era of the Gemara, we would expect a major feature of the calendar to have been established around the same time as Rava and Abaya, Hillel II, who established our calendars. That's certainly the easier answer. However, there are some hints, and modern-day academics drift towards this position, that maybe Rav Adar was an early Gaonic figure, and this was part of the project, again, of tidying up and finishing off various rules which the Amaraim had left incomplete. So just to summarize, it is possible that the very basic structure, even of the mathematics that we use to calculate the whole structure of the calendar, may have been a Gaonic era tidying up of Amoraic approximation, rather than part of the initial structure of the calendar. Now, theologically, again, it's simpler if all of this was established by Hillel II, particularly if you adopt the view that the authority of the modern calendar is based on Hillel II putting the rules in place and effectively Kaddish all the calendars in advance. So again, let me just remind you of this. The Pasuk says that you need the Beis Din to declare the calendar. So how can we have a fixed calendar? Two theories to answer that, Machlokas Rambam and Ramban. One answer is Hillel was Makadish all the dates in advance. Not by listing all the dates. Of course, he didn't do that. That would have taken him days and weeks and months to list all the future dates, but putting the rules in place by which the future dates would be determined. So he said, I am now sanctifying all future Reish Chodeshes using the following algorithms and then putting the calendar rules in place. In which case, it would be very problematic if that's later tweaked by the Geonim. But if you understand the alternative view, that all Hillel did was, I give authority, let's say, to the residents of Eretz Yisrael, the calendar date they keep is what determines the calendar date, then the Gaonim maybe can tweak the modern-day calendar calculation, and as long as their tweak is accepted, that would be okay. Okay, just summarize, because I don't want to spend too long on what's a complicated mathematical matter. The Geonim, as I said, engage in a number of polemics and battles. They established the authority of Babylonian Jewry, ultimately near the end of the Geonic era, and the establishment, the authority of the Talmud Bavli. And they also put in place an enormous number of things, and we're going to run through the rest of them, please God, today. They put in place an enormous number of innovations that standardize Yiddishkeit. They take Gemara, which is formulae and ideas and concepts and arguments and principles, and they establish working versions of all of that, and that perhaps their most important achievement is the standardization and authority of the calendar, though much remains controversial about whether they were merely clarifying traditions or they were innovating, and how to understand all of that. Yes, Simon.
Now that we have computers, can't we
Yes.
double check all the calculations?
So 100%. 2 points. The modern day calculation of calendars, no one is sitting there physically doing the maths. We're using computers to work out. Absolutely. The question is, though, what are the principles of the calculation? So we know that the approximation used isn't entirely accurate. But we don't care because this is the approximation the Geonim gave us, and it's very, very good. As I said, it gets down to 5 hours, 55 minutes, 25.438 seconds. Now we can carry that on and we can say it's not exactly 438 seconds, it's 438.721, etc. But who cares? Meaning, for functioning Jewish life, that level of detail doesn't matter. The Jewish approximation used is astoundingly accurate. It's remarkably accurate, and therefore it works for our purposes. But it's not entirely accurate. And you can never be entirely accurate because you'll end up with infinite decimal places. We don't need it to be entirely accurate. By the way, you will often hear a Kirov argument put forward, in which it is said, how would we have such an accurate calculation of the lunar calendar? This is remarkable. It corresponds to degrees of accuracy only discovered in the 20th century and is clear evidence of our Masorah, the reliability of our Masorah. The Pasuk says, that the accuracy of the calendar calculations are our wisdom and our insight in the eyes of the nations. In other words, the degree of accuracy of the calendar calculations is evidence of correct Sinai tradition and God-revealed tradition of the calendar calculations, and therefore a very powerful Kirov argument that is put forward, in which you show how incredibly accurate to an astounding degree the modern day the calendar calculations are. The problem is that every line in that reasoning is historically inaccurate. It's simply an incorrect argument. It's based on ignorance. It's based on ignorance on our own sources, because we do not have the original Masorah used in order to make the calculations. That Masorah was lost, and this was recognized by the Rambam in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. You can open up the Rambam in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, and the Rambam says explicitly that we are not relying on the ancient traditions. We're relying on turning to the Chachmei Umas Olam, the wise people of the world, in order to understand how to make and do the calculations. So they did not claim that this was the Jewish tradition. It is true that the Pasuk says, we believe that we were granted by HaKadosh Baruch Hu insight into how the calendar system works, and for 1,000+ years that's what was used. HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to Moshe these calculations, but also we recognize that the when I say modern day calendar system, I mean dating back to Rav and Abaya and then on through the era of the Geonim, a very ancient tradition, was not based. We don't claim that this is part of the original Masorah. Number one. Number two, we know that there were these approximations that Chazal used were used by other astronomers at the time. So the idea that no one else in the ancient world knew this is simply incorrect. This was known in the ancient, I'll come to in a moment, this was known in the ancient world by Babylonian astronomers and so on. Babylonian astronomers were no great scientists, meaning they were not like the Greeks. They weren't drawing out principles, but they were great observers. And if you keep enough records for enough years, decades, centuries of when the new moon appears, you will eventually arrive at very, very good recognition. You keep enough records of the solar seasons, you will eventually arrive at very, very good calculations. If you monitor the position of the sun, you will arrive at very, very accurate calculations of the length of the solar year and the length of the lunar cycle. And they did arrive at such calculations. They weren't like the Greeks. They didn't understand what they were seeing. They didn't begin formulating theories about the paths of the planets and the paths of the moon and the paths of the sun and debating heliocentric models and so on and so forth. None of that was going on amongst the Babylonians, but they were observing, and therefore in the same era as Chazal were operating, they knew the maths. And there's no reason that Chazal shouldn't know. There's no hashkafic problem why you shouldn't turn to to the NASA observatory and ask them about the maths of the calculation if you wish to establish a calculation. Again, Chazal were dealing with a new problem, a new phenomena. Rav Abaya, Hillel, however you date it, they can no longer use empirical observation of the moon to establish the calendar. We're going to have to make a fixed calendar. We believe halachically we've been given authority to so do, and now we want to put in place a working model that will help Jews through who knows how long this troubled period will last, but will help Jews as it continues to this day to help us for 2,000 years on and counting, and we're still doing well. So there's nothing wrong with turning to the best observation at the time. So again, did Chazal at that time have some sort of tradition or not? We don't know entirely. All I'll say is, as a matter of historical accuracy, is that the Babylonians knew the calculations to the same degree of accuracy as Chazal. Chazal used their approximations, and the Rambam himself speaks about this in his Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. Sorry, you want to know something?
I was going to ask about and have some answer between calendar stuff debating on.
Okay. Maybe one day I'll give a share on how calendar, or maybe Andrew can give a share on the matter. How the calendars. Andrew helps us, by the way, for those who don't know, in producing our shul calendar and other things. Yeah, the calendar that we use in the London Mason was established, as does Monk's, by the way. It was established by John Conn, Professor John Conn, the father of Rabbi Cohn, Dayan Cohn from North End and Adas, and he produced the tables, and then every year, I did it last year actually. One of the Donim checks the calculations and checks that what the United Synagogue is issuing. Yeah, but that's something different. Yeah.
So it's interesting to note that the Nutzerim,
Yes.
they relied on our calculations for Easter until such time there was
Yes.
a great bit argument that how can you rely on
Yeah.
the Toshav al pair of the year?
So there's enormous. Okay, there's so much to talk about the calendar. I'm not going to go into this. I'll take the chance of having a platform here, both online and live and recording, to mention one thing. This is completely off topic, but since you're giving me the excuse, start times of Shabbos and Yom Tov. There are two myths out there which are really dangerous and need correcting. The first is, in much of the world, and therefore people often quote this in the UK, the published time of the start of Shabbos is 18 minutes before sunset. Now, sunset is the critical time because sunset is the derisive start of Shabbos, and people say 18 minutes. Here in the UK, it's 15 minutes. This is a really serious mistake if people think it's 18 minutes. Here in the UK, we use 15 minutes. Sorry, yeah.
That in the UK it's 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Why isn't it wide open to the line with the rest of the world?
Because we're an old community. Why should we change? Let them change, right? We drive on the. You're English. Well, you're not. You're South African. Okay, we're English, right? We got there first for everything. No, we are the longest established. Sadly, the only European community that kept going through the Holocaust in a normal way was there, and we have Old Ben Hogim, and there are a few other countries that use like driving on the right. I think Cyprus still uses they uses their Okay, number one. No, it's different calculation. Yeah. Everyone uses in the UK 15 minutes across the communities, Federation, S&P. The second thing to be aware of is that mathematically, the time of sunset is 15 minutes after the published time of the start of Shabbos. However, number one, even London is a very large city, and there are minutes of discrepancy between whether you're in West London or East London, whether you're North London or South London. That's point number one. We're lucky that the calculations actually that were put in place for the publication are not too far from Hendon, so we're not way out. But nonetheless, there are discrepancies across London. South London's a very big city. The second point is that halacha determines sunset by the actual sign of observable sunset. That means when you see the sun going below the horizon. Good luck in seeing the sun going below the horizon in Hendon. But in principle, were you standing there? Now, this can be affected by height above sea level, which is another inaccuracy in the calculations, and also by weather conditions. Because without going too much into the science of it, when we see the sun setting, the sun is actually already below the horizon, but the rays of light are bent, and that can be affected by humidity in the air density, air pressure, a whole array of things. And I spoke to someone who is a computer programmer far better than, I'll take his name actually, Ariel Sint, who helped me with this. And he did some of the calculations of how far the discrepancy can be depending on weather conditions. And it can be a significance of 7 minutes. 7 minutes. So we are playing with fire when we sort of have this idea that we can go. Now, it's probably safe to say 5 minutes. If you're stuck in a car and it's absolutely emergency, it's probably reasonable to say you can go within 5 minutes of sunset, of so-called sunset. In other words, 10 minutes after the published time of Shkia. If you really, I mean, if really, we shouldn't be going even 7 minutes closer than that. But I just feel it's sort of a mitzvah class, and I once spoke about it in the pulpit, and many years ago, probably time to speak about it again. But I do think it's sort of one needs to be aware that we sort of live in a time where we think that computers can do all the calculations. Computers can't do the calculations because at the end of the day, halacha is determined by empirical observation of sunset. Empirical observation of sunset can drift by, in rare conditions, as much as 7 minutes from the published time. Again, it's rare, and I would say on balance, probably if you're literally stuck and you're driving, till 5 minutes is reasonable within the rules of sort of halacha. But if one's going sort of 1 minute till Shabbos, one really is playing with fire in that. Okay, this is completely off subject, but I'll take the excuse of mentioning that since you gave me a chance to do so. Okay, let's move on, and all I really want to do today is talk about major accomplishments of the Geonim, things that we take for granted in our lives, but actually come from the Geonim put in place. And this is in no good order. If I try and go I'll try and go roughly in historic order, just to keep life simple. Okay. The first thing that was put in place by the Geonim I already mentioned. I'll go out of order just because it's simpler. One minhag that we all do, a number of minhagim that we do as we go through the year. So I'm going to go through the calendar year. That's how I'll do it rather than the time it was put in place. Um, let's start with the beginning of the year, slichas. So we say slichas before Rosh Hashanah and then through the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. The concept of saying extra prayers of Teshuvah before the Yomim Noraim is an ancient one. We don't know exactly when it started, but the formalization of the structure of Slichas is a Gaonic era innovation. Now, let me just explain what I mean. The Slichas, you may not have noticed this, are structured somewhat like a regular tefillah. It's almost as if they added in another mincha. We start with Ashrei, then we have Kaddish, then we say Bakashas, requests, then we conclude with Vidoy, which is a bit like Tachnun after the Amidah, and then we have a Kaddish at the end, and many people had the practice to say Oleinu after that, unless they're going straight into Tefillah. So for those who say Slichas, for example, at night, many say Oleinu afterwards. Those who say Slichas in the day, we go straight in Shachris, so we don't say Oleinu. So it's sort of like a quasi Tefillah type structure. Who put that in place? This is the Geonim. The Geonim put in place the structure, starting with Ashrei, having a Kaddish, and then saying Bakashas. The actual text of the Bakashas, the poetical texts of the Bakashas, of these requests that we make, date from all over history, some from the Geonim and some from later in the Geonim. You just need to look in your Rosenfeld Salichas book, and you'll see that some of them were written in the 1200s by and so on, the actual text. But the structure of Salichas is a Geonic era innovation. We now move forward in the year, and we get to Kaporos, the practice of swinging something over one's head and davening that should be a way of removing the sin. Again, the first mention of this is mentioned by Rav Nachman Gaon, 9th century. Now, again, he mentions it as an existing minhag, but as far as we can tell, it came into practice in the times of the Geonim. We don't find any clue to it in the times of the Gemara. Then we have the Hakafas and Hoshanas. Now, the concept of Hoshanas and Hoshana Rabbah is mentioned in the Gemara, and the Gemara dates it to the Nevi'im Achronim, to the latter Nevi'im. Quick plug for Ezra and Nehemiah, where we mentioned in Ezra the Nevi'im Achronim, Zachariah and so on, who perhaps we see some clues had observation of Hoshana Rabbah, but the formulaic way in which we have the sort of piyotim and the structure of going around the bim and so on, again, is a Gaonic era innovation. Another circling innovation of the Geonim is the Simchas Torah HaKafos. Again, the Gemara mentions the idea of a cycle of starting and finishing the Torah. And certainly, there were a number of traditions about how to start and finish the Torah and the timings, but the timing of that we've adopted the timing of Bavel, which is a yearly cycle, has to start and finish at some point, and that was this time of year. But again, the celebration of the Hakafos in the way that we do it is a Gaonic era simcha. So very briefly, as people are probably aware, there was a triennial cycle, a 3.5-year cycle of finishing the Torah, which was the minhag in Marava. The Gemara records this in Eretz Yisrael, and Bavel had the minhag of finishing every year. Till the 1200s, we have records of some communities still keeping the 3.5-year cycle. However, from then on, more or less, the annual cycle triumphed, and that's the cycle we keep. If that's the cycle you keep, then it makes sense that there's a siyum, a celebration of finishing the Torah. That's not a chiddush. Nonetheless, the formalization of this dancing on Simchas Torah is a Gaonic era innovation. More than that, they probably fixed the division of the Sedras and of the Parshiot and how they're divided. So you need to get through all the Sedras in a year. It could well be that each shul or each community just split things up. So I don't know if they had a very slow Baal Tefillah that week, they would lay in a bit less. If it's a long summer Shabbos, they would lay in a bit more. If it's a winter Shabbos, they would lay in less. And they'd make sure that by hook or by crook, by the end of the year, they finished the Torah and it wasn't standardized. Again, this is part of the standardization project that the Geonim created, in which they standardized the division of the Sedras, perhaps, and certainly the calculations of how we get through the year. So based on the calendar calculations, we do more or less doubled Sedras and so on. This is all Gaonic era innovation. Yeah. Yes. The concept of finishing every year is mentioned explicitly in the Gemara, and there are hints at it in the Mishnah even. Yes.
Why? What did it do?
Okay, so So this is speculation. So the question just asked is those who are keeping the 3.5 year cycle, did they celebrate anything on Simchas Torah? So there is speculation that on Simchas Torah they lay in. What is the correct laning for Simchas Torah? Were we not to finish the Torah? It's a bit of a funny thing, by the way, that we finish the Torah on a Yom Tov, because the Parsha readings is a Shabbos reading. So we ought to finish the laning of the Torah on the last Shabbos of the year. Why do we read it on a Yom Tov? And what is meant to have been the correct laning of the Yom Tov, right? Perhaps a Yom Tov linked laning. Now, we don't know in the Mishnah era what they lay on Shmini Atzeres or Simchas Torah. However, there is a fascinating Mishnah which tells us, an early Tanaic source, that tells us that they used to lay on Simchas Torah the first perek of Yehoshua. Now, why would you lay in the first perek of Yeshua then? Well, it would seem to link with the continuation of V'zos HaBracha, which seems to link that maybe they thought that the correct laning on Simchas Torah is V'zos HaBracha. And there are theories that came first. In other words, they used to lay in V'zos HaBracha on Shmini Atzeres for some reason. Shmini Atzeres was appropriate as a day of rejoicing over Torah, and therefore whether they were or not finishing the Torah, they were laning the last Sedra. So this is all theories. These things are not clear, and we don't know the answers to these questions. What came first? Was it that the cycle finished then, and then that day became associated with rejoicing the Torah? Or for some reason or other, even those who were keeping the triennial cycle were still reading V'zos HaBracha on Simchas Torah. You've probably heard from over the years a lot of drush. Why are we celebrating the completion of Torah on Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah? What's Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah got to do with the completion of the Torah? And you'll hear all sorts of explanations about now that we've been through the Yom Amaraim, now that we've been through Sukkot, we can now rejoice over Torah. It's possible that there was a rejoicing over Torah even before it coincided with the completion of the Torah, and it's the other way around. They fixed the cycle to finish on Simchas Torah or Shmini Atzeres because that was an appropriate day to celebrate Torah. So the answer is we don't know, and this is all lost in history. However, as far as we can tell, the concept of rejoicing over the Torah may have dated back to the Mishnaic era. That certainly we have a record in the Gemara of a 1 year cycle, and by the time of the Geonim, it had become structured as a Simchas Torah. And that's, I think, the most we can accurately say. The idea of the Chomesh Megillas, the 5 Megillas, spread over different times of the year. So we read Eicha on Tisha B'Av, and we read Rus on Shavuos, and so on. Again, as far as we can tell, probably a Gaonic era innovation. Let me just explain that. There is one Megillah which we have to read, right? This dates back to Megillah to Esther, right? Pre the second Beis Hamikdash, the whole story of Megillah Esther, a whole Masechta Megillah that talks about halachos of laning the Megillah. The Gemara doesn't mention the idea of laning Rus on Shavuos and Eicha on Tisha B'Av and Kariates and Shashirim and Pesach and on Sukkot and Pesach respectively. That's not mentioned in the Gemara. There is a quasi Chazal source called Maseches Sofrim that mentions this, but the dating itself and the finalization of Maseches Sofrim itself is controversial. But as far as we can tell, again, this was certainly established as a practice that sort of became formalized only in the Gaonic era. So it may have been that some people had the minhag that there's links between Rus and Shavuos which are there. There's an appropriateness in reading all these Megillas at each date, but the formalization of that sort of structure, again, as far as we can tell, is a Gaonic era establishment. It only becomes formalized in the Gaonic era. Just before I take your question, there's a lot of debate around brachos that should be made over Gaonic era practices. So our practice in our shul is that when we lay in from a cloth, when we lay in from a scroll, we say a bracha. Achai Gedonim that we've been commanded. Were we commanded to lay in Megillas Rus? Well, it depends what you mean by commanded. I mean, were we commanded to light Hanukkah candles? Well, the Gemara in Shabbos discusses this. How can we say Achai Gedonim lahadik neshel Hanukkah? We know it's only a rabbinic decree; it's not Torah decree. And the Gemara answers, no, the Rabbonim have authority to establish decrees, and therefore ends up as also a Torah decree. Plug for my series when I spoke about rabbinic authority and debate between the Rishonim, what gives them authority. But either way, Chazal have authority to establish decrees, and we can say the tzivonu on that. What about Gaonic established decrees? Do they have sufficient authority that we would say Achai Gedolim tzivonu on that? Right? Do they have such authority to do that? Well, the reality is that we do so. We do so for the Megillas, maybe because the Megillas do date back to the times of Chazal. As I mentioned, there is a Maseches Sofrim, which maybe dates back to Chazal, but it's unclear whether all of it does or part of it does. But even if it's a Gaonic era decree, our practice is that we say Asher Gedolos Tzavonu on it, even though it may be a Gaonic decree. And in a moment, I'll share with you brachas which certainly are Gaonic era brachas, and nonetheless, we say them. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Well,
Yes, yeah. So some shuls don't, right? But our minhag is that we do if we lay in from a scroll. So this is another Gaonic era. By the way, there's another bracha that possibly only dates back to the Geonim, and that's the HaNagid Shel Shabbos. Now, the concept of lighting Shabbos candles is ancient. It's Mishnaic. It's in the Gemara. However, we don't find a record of the bracha of the HaNagid Shel Shabbos until the era of the Geonim. Now, it's always dangerous arguing, from absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe Jews in the era of Chazal were saying the HaNagid Shel Shabbos, and it just wasn't recorded for whatever reason. However, we only know that it became a practice during the times of the Geonim. And if you're minded to talk about historic circumstances, I discussed last week the dangers of ascribing halachic rulings to historic circumstances. It's always dangerous. But I remind you that the Geonim are waging a battle against the Karaites. The Karaites think that you shouldn't have candles burning on Shabbos because the pasuk says "Lo Savaraim b'chol Moshe Seichem," which could be translated as "Don't have a fire burning in your house over Shabbos." The Karaites sit in the dark over Shabbos. Orthodox Jews, what we would call an anachronistic term, but those who accept the authority of Torah BeHa, translate the pasuk as don't light a candle on Shabbos. You can have a candle lit from before Shabbos. And therefore, if this is a matter of debate, it would make sense that the Geonim introduced the bracha. They said, we don't want this to be a drabanan without a bracha, we want this to be a drabanan with a bracha. The counter argument is, since this is a rabbinic decree, why shouldn't they have been making a bracha all the centuries? Why wouldn't they have made a bracha? So again, we don't know. It's just so much that we just don't know about these things. So in brief, one position would be Jews always making the bracha of HaNagid Shel Shabbos from the time it was decreed. On the other hand, it's not mentioned, which is interesting, but not a knockout blow. And it's funny that the Gemara would ask, how can you say Asher Gedolos Tzavonu on Neros Chanukah, which is a once a year mitzvah, and wouldn't ask on Asher Gedolos Tzavonu HaNagid Shel Shabbos, which is a much more frequent bracha. The Gemara is not going to ask it on Megillas Esther. That's the other big drop on him, because Megillas Esther was introduced by the Nevi'im. So if a Navi says to do it, we understand that Hashem is commanding to do it. So the Gemara wants to choose a rabbinic mitzvah. The more common rabbinic mitzvah done is HaNagid Shel Shabbos. The very chapter in which the Gemara is discussing this is in Bameh Madrikim, which we say every Friday night. Again, perhaps a Gaonic era innovation to say it every Friday night, because we want to hammer home you're meant to be lighting Shabbos candles, and you can have candles burning, that we accept the authority of the Mishnah. And in that very perek, the Gemara then begins talking about other lighting mitzvahs, and it talks about Chanukah, and then it says, how can we say Hashem commanded us, and then the mitzvah of Chanukah lights is only rabbinic? Why didn't ask on the more frequent mitzvah, which is the very topical subject? So we have an absence of evidence over here, but it does indicate also a little bit of maybe they weren't saying HaNagid Shel Shabbos. We don't know for sure. There are those who suggest that this is a Gaonic era innovation over here. Yes.
So that is actually Shlomo. So then the question arises, so what about the Rishonim? What explains this stuff?
Okay, so the Rambam sort of answers and discusses this question. Very, very brief. So again, for those online, the question is, so when does the authority of Chazal cease? And if Geonim have the ability to do these decrees? One answer to the question, and I'm misquoting the Rambam here inaccurately, but I'll sort of distort what he says in order to answer your question. One answer to the question may be only when there's centralized halachic authority. So the centralized halachic authority, when you have a central halachic authority, then you can make decrees for all of Klal Yisrael. Once authority is distributed and diverse, you can't make new decrees. Now, there is much indication of this theory. I don't want to go into something beyond the scope of this year, other than say, again, listen to my series on Torah Shabbat Peh, available online in the YouTube. But the Rambam and others are of the view that Chazal level authority is when you have a centralized decision-making body, of which the Sanhedrin was the most extreme example. But in many ways, that continued through the Babylonian era, because all learned Jews were living in Bavel, and they were all talking to each other. They weren't living next to each other, some in Sura and some in Pumbedita, but they were all exchanging conversation back and forth. And to some degree, that situation remained the case in the Gaonic era, and therefore they have some authority, and it's only subsequent to them that was lost. There have been attempts to re-establish centralized authority with the foundation of the State of Israel. Heichal Shlomo project, part of that was an attempt to make a new Sanhedrin, and controversy around that, and later Steinsaltz was involved in an attempt, and that was widely thought because even the frum world, never mind the secular world, are so divided hashkafically and so on. How on earth are you going to get into one room, and what will be the voting rights, and how many rabbonim are we going to have of each group and each sect? We're not in a position to establish centralized halachic authority. It would be a disaster to do that, and therefore we don't have the concept of being able to do that. But briefly speaking, it's possible the Geonim had the authority to establish such things. That's why I'm misquoting the Rambam. The Rambam dates after the Chasimas HaTalmud. The Rambam reduced the authority of the Geonim, but the rest of Klal Yisrael did grant the Geonim quasi-Chazal status. That's a historic fact. We do say these brachas. And therefore, the Vilna Gaon, perhaps was opposed to this also, thought that the era of Chazal came to an end at the time of the Chasimas HaTalmud, and the Geonim didn't have such authority, maybe. But the Minhagim of Klal Yisrael do grant them such authority. Okay, we'll have to stop here, and next week we will talk about other things that the Geonim achieved and established. And then next week I'm going to try and go through the life story of some of the other Geonim, and then I hope the week after that to then focus on a Saadia Gaon, who we absolutely need to get through. But we'll stop here for today. I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you.